Good evening. How are you all doing tonight? Good. Thank you for being here. Welcome everyone to the annual Ivan Stone Lecture on Truth and Technology, Centering Humanity in an Evolving Digital Landscape. My name is Michael Dango. I'm an assistant professor in English and Media Studies here at Beloit and the faculty leader for this year's Weisberg program theme on misinformation and media literacy in the digital age. That means I've had the great pleasure to work with a range of people this past year who have brought innovative programming to campus, including the co-directors of the Weisberg program in Human Rights and Social Justice, Gloria Bradley and Josh Moore, and the fearless project coordinator for CareerWorks and the Global Experience Office, Michelle Campbell. I'd like to start today, if you could just please join me in thanking Gloria, Josh, and Michelle for their hard work and leadership. The annual Stone Lecture is named after Ivan Stone, who was Dean of Beloit College and Director of the World Affairs Center, where he worked from 1939 until 1969. Under his leadership, Beloit reinvigorated its international profile in 1960, when the college launched the World Outlook program. This comprehensive plan for global learning and study abroad, 8 years in the planning, laid the groundwork for Beloit's integrated approach to international education that still thrives today. Alumni who knew Ivan remember him as one of the most influential figures they met during their time here at Beloit, and we're proud to carry on his legacy of global and international engagement through study abroad scholarships, through a grant for summer research in international relations, and through his annual lecture named in his honor. I know Ivan would be proud of our lecturer tonight, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him. Let me start with 3 facts about Dr. Joseph Keller. First, one of the job titles listed on his resume is hacker. Second, while the senior director for congressional and federal relations at the American Psychological Association, he advised the White House on the ethical and responsible development of artificial intelligence. And third, in a recent interview about the carbon footprint of AI, he advocated for collaboration among researchers, environmental scientists, and policymakers. He noted, quote, "Because AI threatens to widen the gap between the wealthy countries and lower middle income nations, equity and AI sustainability should go hand in hand." Hacking, machine learning, psychology, policy advocacy, foreign affairs, international justice, economic equality in the global south, environmental sustainability, Dr. Joseph Keller is a model of interdisciplinarity. He received a bachelor's in biological sciences from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County as a Meyerhoff Scholar, a master's in computational neuroscience from Boston University, and a doctorate in cognitive science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His multidisciplinary dexterity is evident in the many forums that have benefited from his expertise, including foreign policy, Nature, the Washington Post, and other platforms. Dr. Keller truly incarnates all 4 of the integrated learning outcomes we prize here at Beloit. He's an effective communicator, a productive collaborator, a creative problem solver, and he is professionally and intellectually agile. Some of you heard him this morning over lunch, how he brings all of these pieces together. And if you missed out, you have one more chance tomorrow over breakfast at 10 a.m. in Weeks Lounge in Pearson's Hall to learn more about his really inspiring and multifaceted career path. So I hope that you might also join us for breakfast tomorrow. Most recently, Dr. Joseph Keller is a visiting fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institute, affiliated with the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, and the Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative. We are so lucky to hear from him tonight on what it means to center humanity in an evolving digital landscape. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I like that. The thumbs up is very affirming. Thank you so much for having me. I was really excited to come to this campus. It seems you've been having some very valuable and interesting conversations this year talking about misinformation, disinformation. My hope tonight is that I'm just able to join the existing conversation and ultimately learn from all of you about what you've been learning about mis and disinformation, and see if we could try to attack and address this fairly intractable problem. Sometimes your perception shapes your reality. This is Rashomon, a 1950 Japanese film by Akira Kurosawa. Have people either heard of this film or seen the film? Excellent. So it'll be a surprise for some. It tells the story of a murdered samurai and the assault of his wife from the perspectives of 4 different characters. Perspective of a bandit who claims to have committed the crime, the perspective purported to come from the wife herself, perspective of a woodcutter who witnessed the crime, and even the ghost of the murdered samurai. Now, of course, as you might imagine, each of the 4 characters gives us a different account of what happened, and their versions don't all line up. For example, the bandit claims that he assaulted the samurai's wife and then killed the samurai in a duel. The wife claims that the samurai was killed by the bandit first, then providing the vulnerability for her own assault. The woodcutter's story is somewhere in between, and the ghost gives a completely different account of what happened. Now, why am I telling you all of this? You're saying, well, I thought this was a policy talk about misinformation. Well, they say that life imitates art. And in this case, the film suggests that there's actually no single objective truth to what happened in this story, and that each person's perspective is shaped by their own subjective internal motivations. It also demonstrates that humans are fallible, that memory can be unreliable, and that even our own recollections can be distorted by time, experience, and emotion. Folks have termed this the Rashomon effect. It describes the phenomenon of people giving different accounts, contradictory accounts, of the same event. Even our memories are not perfect, and they can be influenced by a variety of factors. People will also lie or distort the truth in order to protect their own reputations and interests. And it's still possible that people may even see the same event in different ways. And I've come to appreciate the complexity of this film because I think it shows how easily misinformation and disinformation can spread, even when people may genuinely believe that they're telling their own truth. It's clear that technology has been skewing our perspective of reality for a while now, and so much of this is not new. The movie Rashomon and the plot it presents are connected to today's misinformation and disinformation in a number of ways. In today's world, confusion often spreads through social media and other online platforms. These spaces allow for people to share information quickly, but they also make it easier for misinformation and disinformation to spread unchecked. Now we see new advances in technology that are throwing our shared sense of reality into question. So I ask this: how could you have a society where we can't all agree on the world that we're experiencing at the same time? This brings us to where we are today. I want to take the time this evening to tell you 3 things. One, I'm going to discuss our common understanding of the concepts underlying misinformation and disinformation, attempt to explain why it's such a sticky problem, and describe how new advances in technology, specifically artificial intelligence, are making things even tougher. 2, I'd like to point out a few very specific ways this new generation of AI-powered misinformation and disinformation has and will sow chaos and discord, sowing harm and undermining our cohesive sense of community. This includes some extremely sensitive processes that are essential to our own democracy, and some horrific events that are further inflamed by the chaos. And lastly, I'll talk about how I believe that humans and humanity are still best and required in this new season of AI, and how understanding and harnessing humanity is more important now than ever. I know that this campus is engaging in a year-long dialogue around these issues, and I think that's fantastic. It's both the best time to be having these discussions and the worst time in seeing how technology has potentially accelerated the harmful impacts of misinformation. These concepts exploit the fundamental aspects of cognition, personality, and bias. And when we unpack the idea of misinformation, we're talking about false or misleading subject matter that's masquerading as legitimate. This is the case regardless of intent. Perhaps there might be a kernel of truth in what someone is saying in a post, or it can actually be spread unintentionally, and unknowingly. But it still induces a form of misdirection and inaccuracy that is disruptive. We think of disinformation as being a specific variant of the concept where is typically the clear intention to deceive or harm. Behind it, there may even be disincentives driving it, the possibility to influence politics or ideology, though the intent component is fairly difficult to try to establish or prove. And sometimes we can be really vulnerable. Research has consistently shown that fake news spreads farther and faster than so-called real news. Some suggest that social and emotional attributes in misinformation give it these special powers. But even though the result has been replicated many times, the context of the information still matters. People often get misled when they see things over and over and over again. Repeated claims are often considered to be more true than non-repeated or novel claims. Research also shows that misinformation can grab hold if it's frequently engaged with, liked, commented on, and shared, especially if it evokes strong feelings like fear. These are all of our cognitive biases at play. And when we confirm what we already believe, we're much, much less likely to doubt or verify information if it already aligns with our own worldview. This makes it extremely hard to stay on top of things because fake news reports are about 70% more likely to be shared than non-fake news. Research also finds that although people are sometimes tricked by misinformation, they're distracted on social media or perhaps not paying sufficient attention to cues that would indicate accuracy. The politically charged nature of many topics today suggests that people also believe in and share information because, in doing so, it can reinforce important socio-political beliefs, identity structures, and values. We're still human at the end of the day. However, this depends on who you are and where you spend your time. Several studies have shown that fake news, on balance, represents a fairly small part of people's overall media diet. And often we find that the spread of misinformation on social media in particular is highly skewed so that a small number of accounts are responsible for the majority of content that's both shared and consumed. This is one of the results that researchers gesture to explain why people are susceptible to misinformation. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, okay, not me. I'm good. I can figure this out. Well, let me know how that goes. We see sometimes that this knowledge can solidify. Some misinformation can hold sway for years, even after facts have been set straight. And this is something that we all struggle with. Even professionals are challenged by these developments. Nearly all journalists say disinformation is a big problem and that they have to find ways to deal with it regularly. And about 90% report that they had to change their journalistic practices accordingly. Even then, still feeling under-equipped to deal with the problem themselves. Some have even admitted to spreading misinformation in their daily work. And now, artificial intelligence has taken many of these issues and turned them on their heads. We know the existence of disinformation is not new, but AI takes it to a different level, specifically through new approaches called generative AI. In 2023, a generative AI chatbot called ChatGPT, which I'm sure you all have heard of, became the fastest growing consumer application, hitting 100 million users in just 2 months' time. Generative AI has changed the game. It has democratized access to advanced technology, typically reserved for the few. It's now in the hands of the many. And this is especially the case for bad actors. You can now create almost anything digital, and it's cheap. You can ask for novel images, videos, and even clone voices. And there's a lot of money in creating these things, and unfortunately there's less money in trying to create products that act in defense. The combination of an expanding social media ecosystem and the availability of advanced AI tools for content dissemination means we're going to see much more disinformation in the future. And we have particular responses to these scenarios. Researchers found that people were 3% less likely to spot false tweets compared to those written by humans. They're relatively comparable. So there's a concerning credibility gap there that exists, and so far we're still struggling to try to address it. Again, this has shifted our perception of reality. Individuals can now leverage what's called the liar's dividend. It has become easier to deny reality now that there are additional methods to both manufacture fake media, even though things that we know to be true and accurate can be slandered by those that consider the content unfavorable or inopportune. Chatbots like ChatGPT from OpenAI, Bard from Google, and Claude from Anthropic, I'm curious about these names. These are large language models that can spout untruths with extraordinary confidence. There's a danger you can't really tell when what they're saying is wrong unless you, yourself, already know the truth. These incorrect responses, they have the potential to increasingly taint our internet experience. In the future, where search engine optimization pages, social media posts, and blogs are progressively made up by AI with the help of AI, false generative AI results can end back up on the internet and be found by search engines masquerading as fact. It can make it much harder to trust the results that we see on now trusted platforms. Generative AI won't just flood the internet with more lies, it can create convincing disinformation for specific groups or for individuals. What people are only starting to understand is how disinformation will become more targeted and better able to engage with people and sway their opinions based on knowing important things about them and the people they spend time with. An important intersection of AI and misinformation takes the form of deepfakes. Synthetic video, audio, or images created through what are called generative adversarial networks, which are a type of machine learning algorithm that can be used to create new data. They work by pitting two neural networks against one another, a discriminator network and a generator network. The generator network is responsible for creating the new data, while the discriminator network is responsible for distinguishing between what is real and what has been made up as synthetic. The two networks are trained simultaneously, and the generator network is constantly learning to improve its ability to fool the discriminator. Over the time, the generator network learns to create new data that is indistinguishable from the original data set that it was trained on. So these models have been used to create realistic images of human faces, generate realistic text, and even generate new music. You consider that iron is sharpening iron. Synthetic speech, video, and images are all within our reach. It's easy to clone or generate someone's voice using an AI program now. We can train an algorithm on a friend's voice and have her say something she never actually said, perhaps in a language she doesn't even speak. Videos can be generated by placing people in locations and in situations in which they've never been, and can depict the face or body of someone to appear as something or someone else. There are plenty of ways to generate AI images from such text, such as applications like DALL-E, Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion. Convincing deepfakes videos are still difficult to produce though, but they're getting better with time, and that might not be the case in a year or so. These new advances for AI aren't just for the tech professionals. They're accessible to you and to me. So I have an iPhone. Of the people that have, Google Pixel phone, the new one that just came out, does anyone have that? Okay, we can't do a demonstration. But, this new Google Pixel phone, it has a feature where you can edit the photos on your phone using AI. These new tools aren't just for ways to change the lighting or fix a photo where your eyes are closed. Using generative AI, you can create aspects of the scene that never actually appeared in the photo to begin with. This is the first mainstream phone to bake generative AI into the photo creation process. That's a big deal. We're entering an era in which we find ourselves questioning the very photos that make up our own lives. You can decide about what that means for you. This slide shows an example of a journalist trying out some of the features on the Pixel phone. On the left, his dog is cropped out of the picture. So on the right, he tries to edit tool to fix what had been done. The other experiments he had worked on, they worked fairly well. But on this one, it didn't go as planned. He says it best, so I'll read what he wrote in the article. Quote, "Then came the most jarring result. In a photo of a pizza restaurant where Mochi's face, presumably the dog, was cut off in a frame, I tried moving her over to test to see if the AI could generate the rest of her head. I didn't expect the software to perfectly reproduce her grizzled mug, but the AI produced something nightmarish. A half-demigod hellhound with a pair of hooves sprouting from her legs," unquote. Now, these are the early days of the app, so a few kinks, they're expected with something like this. That's understandable, but this is certainly a development worth keeping track of. We've now reached a season where AI deepfakes fool a sizable swath of actors, and with sobering real-life implications. Folks may have seen the image on the left before, aptly named the Pope in a puff coat. It might just have been the first meaningfully large-scale incident that engaged the most users and had people questioning, this is real, right? As we discussed earlier, many journalists fell for this image. I use this image in jest, but the image on the right is no joke. It depicts an AI-generated photo of a supposed explosion that occurred near the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Even though the image itself is of extremely low quality, the sensitive nature of the subject matter immediately triggered national security concerns. The stock market plummeted as a result. Deepfakes can be used to exacerbate social division, lower trust in institutions and authorities, and undermine journalism and trustworthy sources of information. Researchers are particularly worried about the potential to have an impact on elections. In the next year or so, we will see more than 2 billion people go to the polls to vote in national elections across more than 50 countries around the world, including Brazil, India, the European Union Parliament, Taiwan, and here in the United States. And recently we've seen that in places like Sudan, India, and Slovakia, a certain form of deepfake has been reaping a unique form of havoc. Audio deepfakes have already proven to be incredibly effective at causing disruption and very difficult to resolve. They already have and will in the future be problematic for trust in the democratic process in upcoming elections. Manipulating audio is becoming cheaper and easier, while many say it's difficult to determine what's real with a high degree of conviction. These recordings could spend days or hours floating around social media before they're actually debunked and proven wrong. And researchers worry that this type of content could create a political atmosphere in which voters don't know what information they can actually trust. The problem is compounded by the fact that detection tools to determine whether or not it's real or fake, they are not widely available. And the inability to definitively prove the authenticity of an audio recording adds to the murkiness and can be exploited by political actors. For example, let's take the recent elections in Slovakia. An audio recording posted to Facebook, individuals can be heard, supposedly, discussing a plan to rig the election. But it was posted during a mandated 48-hour moratorium ahead of the polls opening, so there wasn't actually an opportunity to intervene and debunk them. The audio medium is supposed to exploit a loophole that's in Meta's manipulated media policy, which at the moment only applies to videos. The election was one of the first consequential votes to take place after the EU introduced what's called the Digital Services Act over the summer. This act was designed to better protect human rights online. Also, introduced new rules that were supposed to force platforms to be more proactive and transparent in their ability to moderate disinformation. The Indian internet has also been full of AI-generated songs from Prime Minister Modi. It presents the possibility of shared messages in the voices of politicians to citizens broadly and efficiently across the country in all of its 22 official languages. This may also play a meaningful role leading up to what is considered the largest election in the world. Emerging technologies like generative AI have illustrated a potential impact on the democratic representation. First, a question: what if anyone in the country could occupy your elected representative's time and resources for issues that don't necessarily reflect the will of citizens like you? Advances in machine learning have created natural language models that can mimic human writing and style. They can upend the genuine influence of an average voter on the policy process. Earlier this year, researchers implemented a field experiment to try to expose legislators to both human-written advocacy letters and machine-generated letters that were trained on those same human-written letters. Some results are on the slide. Overall, they found that legislators were less likely to respond to AI-generated content than to human-drafted emails, but by less than 2%. That's a really small margin, even if it's statistically significant. You can see the graphs are very close. The study showed that AI-written letters to legislators were only slightly less likely to be responded to. It indicates comparable efficacy. AI letters are basically just as believable as human-written letters. So, if machines can pass as human constituents, then it is possible that someone could successfully do what's termed as astroturfing. This is a term to describe the process of creating an illusion of widespread grassroots support for a politician, for an idea, or a cause that's misleading, deceptive, or completely false. It's a dangerous practice because it can undermine democracy by making it difficult for people to distinguish between authentic and manufactured public opinion. It can also be used to promote harmful policies or attack legitimate dissent. Government officials in the US are already seeing an increase in submissions during calls for public comment across federal agencies, supposedly urged and supercharged by generative AI. Now we get to more current events. Just a disclaimer that some of these conflicts are still evolving, and my thoughts are with those whose families, friends, and loved ones are touched by them. In Gaza, the war between Israel and Hamas is a series of unfolding atrocities. Numerous examples of fake content have spread across online platforms, and social media has been flooded with misinformation and disinformation. In the aftermath of the terror attacks, there was also a hospital explosion. An individual tweeted soon after the explosion at the hospital that Gaza killed hundreds of people. He has since deleted the tweet and said that his post was based on information provided by what's called a credible journalist. But he's also a social media influencer who was once an advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel and claims that he's been asked to join a task force defending technology for the state. This is a really significant incident. Screenshots went viral because it's an example of someone claiming to be connected to the Israeli government, declaring ownership over the explosion. The case of the hospital explosion has been one of the most contentious and most debated aspects of the war, and we still don't really know what happened. Social media coverage of the war has also brought confusion. Online AI image detecting tools that may or may not work are labeling real photography as fake. Disinformation shared by verified users has been pushing old footage, video game content, and Photoshop images to back their own partisan narratives. And last week we saw the manhunt for the perpetrator of a mass shooting in Maine that left 18 people dead come to a close. But in the hours that followed the worst mass shooting in the state's history, disinformation about the suspected gunman permeated social media with false claims that he had already been arrested. On X, verified accounts posted that the threat had been neutralized and that a suspect had been arrested. A post featuring an accompanying video had been viewed over 2 million times. A community note was attached, making it clear that the claims were false, but that didn't stop people from viewing it. Some accounts labeled the gunman as a liberal, based on the false claim that he voted for the former US President Barack Obama, while others widely tried to link him to the incident crisis in the Middle East, saying that he was a supporter of Hamas. This misinformation makes it incredibly difficult, I'm sure, for the folks in Maine and the communities who are trying to figure out how to manage and keep safe as things are being put out that are uncertain and false. Meanwhile, academic researchers are really worried. They're concerned about a significant change in X or Twitter's policies. It has degraded as a source of information because of recent changes from Elon Musk to remove access to automated functions that were essential for academic research, to do research on the dynamics of political events that we see unfolding. The research community might be handicapped in this way, and it's unclear what impact that'll have on how we're able to understand how discourse takes place on social media. At this moment, we find ourselves surrounded by a multitude of digital challenges that make seeking the truth an incredible endeavor for many communities. But what I still believe remains a crucial concept is our humanity. We may not find clear solutions, but being human will always give us a good chance. Our way to claw back some control may include getting to know our surroundings better and acknowledging what tools we actually have at our disposal. This campus knows well the importance of media literacy. In this environment of generative AI, we need to approach all new information with a critical lens. We must promote broad literacy skills and build resilience against disinformation and continue to warn communities more directly about their threats. It's true, keeping up with the rate of tech advances are really tough. It's almost like we need to develop instantaneous reflexes. With generative AI tools, those waging disinformation campaigns will be able to finely tune their approaches by profiling individuals and groups. They can produce content that seems legitimate and relatable to the other people on the other end, and even target individuals with personalized disinformation based on the data that they've collected. People must be aware of these potential threats and be more careful about the content they engage with. We as humans, we can be tools as well. Pre-bunking and debunking are two psychological science concepts with a rapidly emerging body of work. Pre-bunking is the process of building up a resilience against misinformation before people are exposed to it. This can be done by teaching people about common tactics that misinformers use, and by providing them with the knowledge and tools they need to identify and evaluate their own misinformation. Debunking is the process of correcting misinformation after people have been exposed to it. And one might equip people with accurate information and refute the false claims that they have heard, but this may prove to be harder thing to do in comparison. There's a researcher in the United Kingdom who's done extensive work on this. He and his research community have developed a number of effective pre-bunking interventions, including something he calls the inoculation theory. It's based on the idea that you can build up resilience to misinformation by exposing people to a weakened dose of it in advance. This helps people develop a sort of mental antibody against misinformation and makes them less likely to be persuaded by it when they're exposed to it in the future. These results have shown that pre-bunking interventions can be very effective at reducing people's susceptibility to misinformation. And in one study, a pre-bunking intervention reduced people's belief in climate change disinformation by up to 50%. Pre-bunking is generally considered to be more effective than debunking, as it can help prevent people from believing the misinformation in the first place. These are important tools, but others are sorely needed. Research has also provided us with a growing collection of tech-related tools to mitigate mis- and disinformation. Some are exploring fingerprinting and watermarking. This involves adding a unique identifier to digital content, such as an image or a video, that can be traced back to its original source. Some are proposing measures to improve content provenance and attribution, and this describes a set of standards for tracking and verifying the authenticity of digital content. Tools of this kind can help identify the creator of a piece of content, as well as the date and time where it was created. So others are using open source intelligence tools to fight back against disinformation directly. These are tools that can be used to collect information and analyze publicly available sources, like social media websites and news articles. One recent example of how artists are fighting back against generative AI is this new technique that lets artists add an invisible change to the pixels of their digital art before they upload it to the web. This is a preventative measure, so that if it's scraped into AI training set in the future, it can cause the resulting model to break in chaotic and unpredictable ways. It is intended as a way to fight back against AI companies that use artists' work to train their models without the creator's permission. The application is called Nightshade. It comes from researchers at the University of Chicago. It disrupts the training data in ways that can cause serious damage and renders some of the outputs useless or odd. Dogs can become cats. Cows can become boats. Eggs can become cars. The work itself is still under peer review, but it's an example of the community coming together to try to develop tech tools that can help fight back against these changes. Around the world, governments are also taking notice and being primed to action. They are considering measures to exert regulatory pressure on the sector with incentives and with punishment. The Biden-Harris administration recently struck a deal with some of the most influential AI companies, encouraging them to create specific guardrails for their AI tools, including what we talked about with watermarking and content generated by AI. However, many have been criticized about the potential impact of so-called voluntary commitments. On Monday this week, the White House unveiled a much-anticipated executive order aimed at tackling the risks and harnessing the benefits of AI. They hope to give Congress a little bit of a boost. And it's the broadest step taken by the administration so far in trying to tackle AI threats, ranging from national security to consumer privacy. The declaration instructs the Commerce Department to produce guidelines for watermarking that can be used to label photos and videos produced by generative AI tools in order to root out those deepfakes that are associated with them. AI companies will use this guidance to develop labeling and watermarking tools that the White House hopes the federal agencies themselves will come to adopt. However, the tech is not all the way there just yet. We are still in need of ways to determine whether or not something was created by a machine. At the same time, Vice President Harris was sent to the UK for a summit on AI governance held this week. In the US Senate, Chuck Schumer is leading a bipartisan group of lawmakers focused on crafting AI legislation, but they're likely months away. Some members of Congress are also concerned about the spread of misinformation on social media platforms or exploring how it can be addressed by companies. But other members are more concerned about social media's impact on repressing free speech. But both of them have focused on a section of law called Section 230, which protects websites from being sued for things that are posted on their sites. Around the world, others are also designing their own policies at the same time. The UK government is holding this summit that I mentioned that's happening this week as we speak today and yesterday with the hope of establishing intergovernmental agreement on limiting AI's enormous risk. It's billed as the first major global AI summit of its kind. However, many have criticized the guest list, which appears to give an enormous platform to big tech companies and leave out wider civil society. The EU AI Act, which is now in its final stages of negotiation, has been in development for several years by the European Union, and is expected to be approved by the end of the year, some think. It demands transparency, such as disclosing what content is actually AI generated and publishing summaries of copyrighted data used for training AI systems. Europe's effort to fight back against misinformation is very different from what's happening here in the States, which the process has been mired in political friction and controversy. It's unclear what steps, if any, the US government is going to take in shaping how platforms allow misinformation on their sites. And in August, the Cyberspace Administration of China announced that it's going to enforce AI regulations, including those requiring that generative AI developers prevent the spread of misinformation or content that challenges Chinese socialist views. The G7 also plans to ask AI companies to agree to watermarks that seem to be a common thread of approach that people are taking to generative AI images. People around the world are working on these issues, but they're going to need more help. So as we close, I'd like to go back to my initial reference of the film Rashomon. In this scenario, we as the audience are viewing and receiving the narrative from the story. It's sort of a passive process. I now consider this storytelling process or partnership no longer to be in one direction. The paradigm has been shifted. We must now play a larger role in this storytelling process. We must all be, in the film sense, actors, directors, producers, and grips, because we're going to need snacks. And in truth, this is kind of the way it's always been. But we now need to prepare for a new modern reality. So with that, I'm grateful for your attention and look forward to seeing how all of you take part in the art of storytelling. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. We have some folks walking around with mics. So if you have a question for Dr. Keller, please raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Thank you for your timely presentation. My question is, so you talked a little bit about how AI can be used to impact elections. You referenced India, among other countries. So I was wondering, how can AI be used to facilitate transnational oppression tactics against diaspora communities abroad?
That's a really good question. And it's one that doesn't necessarily take AI to facilitate their oppression. There have been new rankings on the countries in the world that are most oppressive when it comes to internet control. I think that is perhaps the best example of the way that governments across the world are using some of these methods to try to control narratives and repress free speech. That probably has a very direct connection against who shows up and who speaks up in regards to elections. Those rankings are done by an organization called Freedom House. And so one of the things I want to talk about tonight had to do with those rankings. They're relatively recent. The results are somewhat bleak. They basically say that authoritarian regimes are rising and that there's a trend towards more repressive control over free speech globally. The numbers don't all bear that out, right? This is the story, this is the trend, but your point is a good one. And I think we should look towards examples of repression of free speech through control of the internet as one way that it may have impact on elections in some of these spaces. Does that answer your question?
I know you've commented on how AI has interacted with art, marketing, and just in misinformation online. Could you comment on when it interacts with humans themselves? I know there has been apps made and companies based off of just like Snapchat with AI Buddy and an app called Replica, which basically promotes dating AI.
Yeah, dating AI, companion AI, I think this, there are some people in the tech community who speak very strongly about the potential for AI to serve as human companions. They think that in the future there is a method to create therapists, to exercise therapy sessions. As someone who's taken therapy before, I'm skeptical about how that's going to go. But I think what you're talking about represents an interesting trend and optimism on the way that AI and chatbots in particular can serve not only as thought partners, but as actual partners. There are parts of the world where people are carrying out relationships with those that are in digital form. I think that can serve a purpose. There may be a place for that. I think the concern comes where my background as a neuroscientist, I want to think about in what ways do relationships with chatbots in a closed-off way preclude an individual's capacity to develop connections in the real world. And so ultimately, everything comes down to balance, wondering how you can, in moderation, balance the relationships that take advantage of some of the benefits of these new chatbots and their functionality, but also acknowledging that for the moment, having an exclusive relationship with a digital entity or chatbot can be problematic. And before we talked about data privacy, I think, one concerning aspect of that interchange is that these conversations and exchanges are basically data collection tools. And it's uncertain what happens with that data. The point being that you may lose control over it, and it's not clear what happens after you share it. So what you point to is a very important development. And I think there are benefits. I think there are some clear and obvious concerns. The point being, we need to see how that's going to unfold.
Hi, my question is more so in terms of equity of access to AI, because you spoke about how in today's society of access to the internet, generative AI is pretty well distributed. I would think more so in like industrialized countries versus other countries, and I guess I'm more so asking about, should the focus be more so on regulating those who already have access, or should there also, or in tandem, also be a focus on increasing or even introducing these tools to those who lack access to them in the first place?
That's a really, really good point. Your point addresses an issue around equity. There are a few things happening there, I think. One is that the tools that are created by mostly Western, wealthy countries do provide access to tools around the world. That is important. However, at the same time, not all the tools created in one space or environment are the same effective tools to be used in other places and environments. And even if there's an inappropriate usage, there actually could be a negative or detrimental usage, a harmful one. And so understanding where technology created in one place is appropriate to be used in another, I think that's one part. Your point about access is something that the technology community is trying to address, but the question has to be who benefits. So if a company says, or the industry says, well, we're going to help take these products to those that need them. Well, what's in it for the companies? And in what ways are they going to benefit by bringing these tech products to places where they don't currently exist? And what harms may happen if they're used inappropriately? So I'd probably ask those two questions. And so access is loosely tied to internet access as well, and so that's also an aspect of the conversation, I think.
Do you think there will come a point in time where AI will replace workers such as like artists, writers, and the like in larger organizations?
My personal hope is no. This is a debate that's playing out right now. I mentioned the tech tool Nightshade. That is just one example of the recognition people have that the next community, in this case, the artist community, is under threat. There's important conversations about acknowledging people's creation, and then there's discussions about, well, what is art? Is it something that's created by humans alone? Does there have to be a muse or an inspiration that is human-inspired? There's also conversation for digital art that is beautiful and using tools to create new innovative ways and new innovative media. I think the concern has to go back to who's at the table and who benefits. So in my mind, a perfect world would be a table where the artist could also participate equally to the designing of both the products and the regulation of those products. I mean, right now there are many, many lawsuits being launched across the world from companies that are recognizing that their data information are being used by these companies and their generative AI, and they want compensation for it. Compensation, I think, is one aspect of that conversation. But others have to do with, the existential aspect of it. And then I think, lastly, that's also connected to jobs. Will technology take the place of people's jobs? And in what way is that contributing to society in a meaningful way? In what way is that a shortcut? Ultimately, much of the discourse is being dominated by certain voices, and it's my hope that that landscape is somewhat set straight. Hopefully that answered your question.
Hi, bit of a simple question, but is it realistic to believe in where we can reach a point where AI either won't be able to be used maliciously, or where tools will have reached the point where it simply becomes obsolete.
When you say obsolete, what do you mean?
I mean, from those who use AI maliciously with intention to spread disinformation or things of that nature.
I'm not optimistic, but I love the idea. I think the threats that we perceive now on the internet, on the web, when your mother told you to, not talk to strangers, those are still effective advice and tips. I think it's just about changing the perspective and acknowledging the new environment and reality. So, no, unfortunately, I don't think there's a way for us to ensure that the progression and advancement of these technologies leads to a place where they're defanged, so to speak. But I think acknowledging what their functionality is, the harm they could cause, and trying to keep up with developments, I think that's part of the strategy. And what's really interesting about the moment right now is that this is a moment where many more people are having an opinion about this because the potential threats are much more clear than they have been for a long time. Does that make sense?
So you kind of briefly discussed, and this has been brought up like a couple of times, like the role of journalism, especially right now when like news breaks like that, everything goes up online like really fast. What strategies do you think that broadcast media can make in order to kind of mitigate the consequences of deepfakes and AI? And like what policies do you think could also be made to kind of prevent the spread further on?
Well, I think one of the things I noticed in tracking some of the legislative proposals is that many people across the world, including in the US, are thinking about this approach of watermarking or providing these fingerprints. Trying to acknowledge in some sort of way, if you're a company that has a product that has used generative AI to create it, you must include some sort of disclosure. It's not clear that everyone's going to follow that. And so that's one idea I hope is going to be a part of the arsenal that we have, and for journalists to use to distinguish between what is real and fake. Not having the journalistic background myself, I'm really eager actually to see how the community deals with this. And in many ways, they're a part of the general public that's trying to deal with misinformation. However, the mandate to be a part of the community that sends forth true information or more factual information is a burden that I don't have and that most people don't have. And so I guess my answer is I'm not sure how that community can specifically have better tools than the rest. I think my hope is that in this moment, given what we know about how things are changing, that this urgency will lead to action.
So I read an article published by Brookings in 2022, and it was noted that there was a focus on debunking information for English-based sources and media in comparison to other languages like Spanish. So my question is, since then, has there been any improvement on focusing that inequality, and is there anything that you would like to add on to that?
Great question. The answer in short is no, we haven't made a lot of progress there. What you point out is a really significant part, which is that the language of the internet has an over-representation of English. That is not how language is represented across the world. And so what that leads to is confusion. When translation happens, it leads to an unequal representation of information that's in non-English and for non-English speakers. What very smart people are trying to do is change that. They're trying to insert more dialects and languages into the corpus of data that's used to train some of that, but it's really slow going. And ultimately, the products that the most people use are going to need to be the places where the most diversity in language and other ways have been infused into the training data sets. And that might take a while. And ultimately, there might be a need to both change the incentives, either through punishment or positive incentives and regulation, or to have more people who are thoughtful about that issue to be working on these topics, which I think is also a good thing.
Thank you, Dr. Keller.